Graham.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to the refresher training that PC Alan Payton and PC Nicole Short had. We mentioned under reference to the scope records earlier today that Payton had refresher training on the 4th of January 2015, and that included OST and first aid spells training. And Short had refresher training on the 25th of February 2015, also including OST and first aid spells training. Both received their refresher training from instructors including Graham Patience. Do you remember Graham Patience?
The name slightly rings a bell, but no.
So PC Payton also received refresher training from Alan Smith, who was one of the officers at Hayfield Road. But in relation to Graham Patience, he has signed a witness statement that's available to the chair as evidence to consider. And I'd like to just go through some of that with you, just in the very same way that we did this morning.
Okay.
Thanks. So you'll see on the screen SBPI 00385 PC Graham Patience. This is his inquiry statement. And at paragraphs 56 and 59, he says that he delivered these refresher courses on the 4th of January 2015 and the 25th of February 2015, which were attended by Payton and Short, that he delivered this training as per the 2013 manual. So he has given a statement to the chair saying he at least was using the 2013 manual during those two refresher training programmes in 2015. And that would be in accordance with what you said this morning, that should have been done.
Yes.
Thanks. Could we look at, start with paragraph 60, please? He had given a statement to PERC previously, and he was referred to that. And this is a quote on the screen from that PERC statement. I'd been asked by the investigators if there was anything taught specifically about recognising a person suffering from drug-induced psychosis. I must clarify that this was covered within the excited delirium chapter of the manual. I would discuss with students that excited delirium could be drug-induced, commonly caused by cocaine, but could be caused by other substances also. We would discuss signs and symptoms and how to recognise when someone was suffering from this. I must note the overarching principle taught with regards to this was when officers were to identify an individual as suffering from either positional asphyxia or excited delirium, they should be considered a medical emergency and treated as such. So that was his statement to PERC that he refers to in the inquiry statement. And I think that seems to accord with what you've been talking about this morning. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
So someone with those signs and symptoms, whatever the cause, whatever brought those signs and symptoms on, they should primarily be treated as a medical emergency. And is that the type of training that was being given?
At that time, yes.
Right. So can we move on, please, to the next paragraph, 61. I'm asked to outline the topics that were covered during the 14-15 recertification programme relating to excited delirium. And he says it's hard to remember exactly now because it's not clearly treated as that now. And I think we've mentioned earlier, things have moved on significantly from nowadays from the references about excited delirium that were in the 2013 manual. Yes. The chair has a lot of evidence about that already in front of him. And we'll touch on that again later when I look at the manual. But he said in 62, to assist with my memory, I'm asked if the following areas were covered in the recertification training. I'm asked if signs and symptoms of excited delirium were covered. Yes, we would much the same as it is now. You would run through every kind of stage of it, what to look for. It's how somebody would be acting and the type of behaviour displayed. So again, he seems to be focusing there on it's the behaviour that's being exhibited, which is of significance.
That's correct, yes.
And at 63, he says, I'm asked if the risk factors were covered, and he says yes, they were. At 64, he is asked about the management of someone exhibiting excited delirium, and he says it was about making sure that an ambulance was called because the person could potentially go into cardiac arrest. Do you agree with that, that was part of the training in 2015?
Yes.
And we've heard evidence in the inquiry that that is done by officers using their personal radio, and that information is relayed to ACR, who can then call for an ambulance if required.
Back then, yes.
And that was the position then.
Yes.
And if we can move the screen down a bit, please. That was one of the main features of it, that it was to be mindful over anything else. If somebody was acting, as excited delirium was at the time, in such an excited manner, their heart rate would be elevated potentially, to be mindful that this person could suffer cardiac arrest at any time. So it must be treated as a medical emergency. And that was the kind of overriding thing about it. Is that your recollection of the approach that was being taken at the time?
Yes.
Thank you. And then if we can move on, please. And he's asked if the topic of excited delirium was only covered in OST training and not SPELLS refresher training. And he said yes, as the SPELLS was literally CPR and recovery position at the time. So the training on excited delirium actually was in the OST course material.
Excited delirium was in the OST material, yes.
Thank you. If we can look at 66. He says, as it relates to officers being trained to call an ambulance if someone was exhibiting signs of excited delirium, I'm asked if the recertification training also covered the type of information that should be communicated to a handler or paramedics on the scene. I wouldn't say specifically. It was more a case of monitoring the person, and rather than corralling somebody in, or not necessarily taking hold of somebody unless it became assaultive, it was more of a case of monitoring somebody the best you can until more qualified help came, making sure an ambulance is on the way. I'm interested in your views on this paragraph as it describes the type of training that was being given at that time.
I don't know if this was just this officer's way of delivering. I don't remember in the training material at that time talking about corralling, as we would probably call it now, contain rather than restrain. And I can't remember much in the manual at all at that time about the safe management. So I don't know if this is coming from his own knowledge of, or I don't think this is a lift from the manual. But that's a way to deal with that instant, yes.
Is there anything that's said there that you would disagree with in terms of the training?
There's nothing I would disagree with, no. Although other than whether it was in the manual or not,
Right.
is debatable.
Right, thank you. And then look at 67. During the recertification training, I'm asked if anything was taught in relation to communicating, for example, that a subject was struck in the head with a baton, or that CS spray had been used on the subject. Well, from a personal level, that would be a kind of no-brainer, a common sense approach to me. That's something that I would personally pass, yes. However, at the time of the training, it's difficult to recall if that was something that would be a generic thing, but certainly it would be information that I would expect officers to pass. If somebody had been sprayed with CS spray at the time or had been batoned, I would expect that would be something that was conveyed to medical staff on the handover, but it's hard to recall if that was an actual part of the teach at the time. I'm interested in any comments you have about the sort of information that would be communicated over ACR, communicated through them to the ambulance personnel. Do you have any recollection of training that would be given at that time?
I don't recall anything in the training at that time that outlined what information should be passed to an ACR if one of these tactical options were to be used. And I think I agree with the officer here that for me, if an officer struck someone with a baton or deployed their CS spray, or there was an injury as a result of the restraint, then I would expect that information to be passed to the ACR so they could then pass it to the ambulance service, which then allows them to triage that appropriately. So, yeah, I mean, that is the common sense, best practice thing to do, but as far as specific training on what to pass, I don't think there was anything.
Thank you. Could we look at the next paragraph, 68? He was asked if officers were taught on actions taken up identifying someone exhibiting excited delirium, in addition to treating the situation as a medical emergency and calling an ambulance. If I could start with what not to do side of things, it was kind of stressing the fact that it wasn't always best practice to maybe hold somebody down. If somebody could be given the space to potentially calm down or something like that, then that was a method to consider, because of some of the signs evident of somebody with excited delirium could be the fact that they might be afraid of reflections and things. They might see that as a threat. The large movements that somebody might take, the way they're moving themselves about, to be mindful of things like that. I'm not saying it's wrong, but to consider it, to give somebody the space, the element of freedom, to contain rather than to immediately restrain somebody, unless it was relevant at that time to do that. I'm interested in your comments about this paragraph. Maybe we could go back up to the beginning of it, so you can see the start. So he's talking about, obviously we've spoken earlier about excited delirium, medical emergency, calling an ambulance. And he says, so it was kind of stressing the fact that it wasn't always best practice to maybe hold somebody down. If somebody could be given the space to potentially calm down or something like that, then that was a method to consider. I'm interested in your recollection of any training at that time that relates to maybe giving someone space to calm down.
I would need to see the manual, because sitting here at the minute I can't recall exactly what the specific wording of the 2013 manual as it relates to this. I don't know if this is, because he's using terms in this paragraph that we definitely weren't in the 2013 manual. Contain rather than restrain, talking about if a person's showing signs of ABD, they're being afraid of reflections in glass and stuff like that. I don't think that was in the 2013 manual. So maybe in this paragraph, what he has subsequently learned is maybe referring to there. But as I say, yeah, that's best practice, and that's what we talk about since 2016. I'm not sure that's in the 2013 manual, so maybe that's where this is coming from, his knowledge from what's been subsequently taught.
We'll have a look at the 2013 manual.
And I may be wrong,
later.
but I don't think that's...
That's very helpful, thank you. Could we look at, well, let's move on to 69. There was instruction about that kind of thing, about what to consider given the circumstances you're faced with. You have the option of taking hold of somebody, but equally that might not be the best action to take at the time. Could you consider giving them the space while still containing them? So that was the options. And again, there's the reference here to the word containing. Was there training given at the time to officers about thinking about what their options were, thinking about whether restraint was the best course of action?
Whether individual instructors would provide that information during their courses, may be the case. I don't, at that time, that really wasn't the ethos of the officer safety training programme. I don't recall, you know, containing negotiating within the OST manual as an option then. And these were all the, I suppose, the omissions that I identified as we moved forward. And we brought in the tactical options model and more round about the national decision model, was teaching officers these additional options that, in my experience, were never really taught.
So this may be about the more enhanced 2016 training that was provided at a later time.
I suspect that may be the case, because the phrases and the terms that are being used here weren't really commonplace back in 2013 at all.
Right, thank you. Could we look at paragraph 71? And again, he's talking about the recertification training, and he was asked if it covered the topic of restraint of subjects who were under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And he says, PC patient says, I don't think it was specific. I think it was just on a general, like we talked about a couple of minutes ago about, you know, considering all the aspects of it. And again, as with everything, I know with ST, it was options open to you. Sorry, that's difficult to read out that section, but his recollection appears to be he didn't recall specific training on the topic of restraint of subjects who were under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Is that correct?
Yeah,
To your recollection?
There was no specific training on that, no. It was a risk factor. It was always, you know, mentioned as a risk factor, but no specific training as to how to either communicate or restrain someone who is under the influence of drugs and alcohol.
Where there is an absence of training on a specific topic, is the matter then simply left to the discretion of the officers?
I would probably suggest so, yes.
Based presumably on their own skills and experience and what they see others doing?
Based on their own knowledge, experience, skill, we at that time relied heavily on people's own interpersonal skills.
Right. And was that for all officers? There was a reliance on their own skills?
I never received any training in how to communicate with violent individuals, how to de-escalate any of that conflict resolution. So, yeah, if you take that omission, it would be that we would be relying on officers' own, you know, self-communication skills.
And that was when you started as an officer, was it? You didn't receive any of that training?
Never received any of it as I started, or the first time I actually received any sort, and it wasn't even specific, was when I undertook my firearms training.
Right. When was that?
2001, 2002.
So for officers training to become firearms officers, they would receive that specific training?
There was additional training to firearms officers and I believe potentially public order trained officers, but I couldn't say for certain. But whether there was specific training or not, or it was an expectation of you, and they tried to enhance your existing skills, there was definitely, you know, I suppose if you want to call it enhanced communication provided during firearms training because of the nature of the role.
But nothing specific for probationer or refresher training in the normal officer safety training programme, even up to 2015?
I don't recall any communication, de-escalation type training. It was in the manual, but I don't ever recall it being in the PowerPoints for initial courses, and I don't ever recall receiving it or seeing it done in refresher training, no.
We'll come back to that when we look at the manual and PowerPoint. So I think moving on to 72, Graham Patience talks about how to identify an individual experiencing a mental health crisis, and he's asked if the recertification training covered that, and he said yes, because one of the scenarios, and I think it's still pertinent in the current training, if you have a scenario-based part of training, there was usually somebody going through a mental health crisis. For example, you may have the students involved expecting that it's going to be somebody who's going to be committing a crime or something like that, and the person they're faced with may be somebody that's going through a mental health crisis. It changes the situation completely. So yes, that was definitely involved. And I'm interested in this paragraph, not just in relation to the mental health crisis aspect, but also in the idea that he's talking about here, talking about a scenario-based part of the training. Do you remember what type of training was being provided at this time?
As part of my national review, I visited a number of training venues across the country to review and I suppose baseline and benchmark what was being carried out across the country. I didn't see any scenario-based training, and all as I say, maybe this officer delivered it during when he was delivering his training. I never saw any evidence of scenario-based training.
Right. And we've heard something of scenario-based training, and we have other statements available. In fact, I think we'll be coming on to a paragraph in Graham Patience's statement later, where he talks about there being quite a lot of benefits of scenario-based training. Can you explain to the Chair what that is?
So if you look at the available, I suppose, or what I could find academic articles, research that I could find, and from speaking to other forces across the world, for a practical activity such as officer safety training, control and restraint, one of the best teaching methods that will get the best results is that operationally based, scenario based training. So that's where you put your students in as a realistic as you can situation with a role player, and the role player will have a brief. That role player will act out a situation, and that officer has to put their training into practice in a practice based situation. And as I say, for me, and probably for most other people in this type of training environment, scenario-based training for these practical activities is by far the best types of training you can deliver, and it gets the best results.
And when you say it gets the best results, what sort of results are you talking about?
So it embeds the learning. If your assessment criteria or your learning outcomes are based on a practical activity, then the best way to assess that practical activity is through a practical assessment, if that makes sense. So if you want to embed learning, if you want to make sure your learning outcomes are met for a practical activity, the best way to do that is through a practical scenario. And that, because that then allows that officer or that student to put what he or she has learned into practice, what they've learned into practice, and it allows the instructors to assess if they're meeting those designated assessment criteria.
And so it allows the officer to take account of all the training and information they've been provided with, use their own interpersonal skills, access whatever equipment's required, and respond in a sort of the equivalent of a real life situation.
Exactly. We can teach someone how to use Pava spray in a gym hall. We can teach someone how to swing a baton in a gym hall. But they were in isolation. Very few officers will ever spray Pava spray in that isolated type of environment. So what we want, the best way to train that activity is, as you say, to put them into that role-playing situation where they have to be cognizant of the situation, they have to assess that threat and risk, they have to choose a tactical option that's proportionate, necessary and reasonable, and they have to deal with that situation as it unfolds. So that if you don't have scenario-based training, it's very sterile and it's not realistic, it's not operationally relevant.
So that scenario-based training will give them, that individual officer, what is akin to actual real-life experience, but in a controlled environment. And would it be fair to say it's also exposing them to scenarios they might come across in real life,
If done properly, yes.
which can be quite stressful or worrying for the officer?
Yes. I mean, one of the, I suppose, the negatives is you can't realistically replicate the operational environment and the threat that you face in that environment. You know, in introducing a training plastic knife or baseball bat or whatever will never ever replicate, you know, the actual physical environment if you are faced with a baseball bat or a knife or a particularly violent individual. So it has to be a bit more measured, you know, and a bit more controlled. But as best you can, as you say, to expose the officers to that. And it allows them also to see their own shortcomings and maybe and it allows instructors there to identify if they need potentially more training on interpersonal skills and tactical communications, on their movement and their threat and risk awareness, threat and risk assessment, situational awareness, etc.
So creating a much more realistic situation, which can the officers then learn more from having gone through that experience rather than just being taught from a manual?
Taught from a manual and just carrying out techniques on a compliant role, not or a compliant colleague, because that's how it was always done. So whilst there has to be caveats to that, because you can't fully control a subject maybe to the same extent as you'd have to an operational environment and training environment because of injury, etc. But if you look at firearms training, public order training, even taser training now, it's all very, very heavily scenario based, because it's accepted that's the best type of training for that type of activity.
And that's your own personal experience that it is a better type of
By far,
training.
Yes.
Yeah. But from your knowledge of training in 2014, 2015, you didn't see any examples of scenario-based training in what you watched?
Not in OST, no.
Although Mr. Graham Patience does seem to be describing a scenario-based part of training involving someone who's suffering from a mental health crisis. But you think that could have been something he was doing himself?
Potentially.
Right, thank you. Could we move on to paragraph 84, please? So, Graham Patience is asked about the time he had to teach excited delirium alongside other topics, and whether the amount of time he had to teach those topics affected the quality or adequacy of training. And he says, I think so, yes. But on balance, I suppose the move to a 2-day course gives us more time these days. You've told us about it now moving to 2 days. Do you have any comments or thoughts about, in 2014, 2015, it was only 1 day, you've told us that already, about the amount of time that instructors had to train refreshers?
I think it was part of one of my review recommendations, but in any case I did put briefing papers in. In my view, 1 day was insufficient. And so what we had to do to mitigate that was we removed a number of techniques from the programme. Because what we were finding was that I think we had 84 different techniques in the programme, many of which officers had never used, wouldn't use, told us they wouldn't use. They were very complicated. So what we had to look at was do a use of force review and identify those techniques that were most commonly used and most effective, and remove a number of parts of the programme to allow us to better train the officers in a smaller amount of techniques. Because what we're finding was we had officers coming in for a day and maybe spending 30 seconds practicing 80 techniques. So what we had was officers leaving that day having been exposed to 80 techniques, but really not being particularly comfortable in many of them.
And did that review then provide more space to teach things like excited delirium, recognising signs and symptoms, or was it only really in relation to techniques and rationalising those?
So I can't remember the lesson plan, how long was allocated to the excited delirium input, but I think that was actually negated because we had introduced the standalone mandatory training on acute behavioural disturbance in 2016. So there wasn't a need to talk about excited delirium. That had been replaced, the term itself, but also we had replaced the physical input during OST with the mandatory online training.
So the changes post 2016 freed up time within the OST programme because excited delirium became a standalone matter.
Yes.
Could we look at paragraph 89, please? And this is where Graham Patience is asked to talk about training on arrest and restraint techniques in 2014, 2015 and now. And initially 89 he says, I'm asked if the recertification training, insofar as it relates to restraint, cover the following topics outlined below. I'm asked if it covered the application of weight and pressure to a subject during restraint, particularly in the torso area. So you remember, this is we looked at statements previously, and I think Shaw was asked the same sort of question.
Yes.
So Graham Patience has been asked the same question, and he says, yes, it was. That was definitely included. As I said before, there was a lot of time, a lot of effort put into the fact that you shouldn't be putting any pressure on the centre line, on the spine, neck, that kind of thing. And again, being mindful, and you put it out to the class, what could that cause? And the answer that be expected would be positional asphyxia. I still do it to this day, making sure that we're not putting pressure on the spine or the centre line of the back. So that's a big aspect of control and restraint. And again, does that accord with your recollection of the training that was given at the time?
Yes, it does.
And where he talks about centre line of the back and spine, is there a distinction there that we should be aware of?
Not a distinction per se, but the centre line obviously runs down the centre of the back, and so it's that general area, the centre either side of the centre line.
Right. And again, where he's talking about pressure, that could be weight, body weight as well.
Yes.
Could we look at paragraph 92, please? I'm asked if the training covered the appointment of a safety officer, in particular when attending a knife incident. Not exactly, no, that's not something that I'd be aware of. Again, I think it would be up to the officers attending to make sure that they're keeping themselves and their colleagues safe, and anyone else keeping the public safe. So I think he doesn't remember a safety officer in particular at that stage either.
No.
That's actually what you have said
Yes,
already.
that's correct.
95, please. I'm asked if the recertification training, insofar as it relates to restraint, cover the risk associated with restraining someone in the prone position. Yes, that's as it is now. That's not changed because the risk is still the same. And again, the main ones for me would depend on body size and alcohol, intoxication, etc. That's still a big risk, and that's still taught the same. And I think that's what you've been telling us today.
Yeah, there is slight changes to what we talk about. It used to all just be positional asphyxia. We now talk about restraint-related asphyxia, and we've brought into positional asphyxia that it's not necessarily having just to lie in the prone. You can have positional asphyxia if you're in the W position, if you're sitting. So there's other parts that we've brought in since to try and, I suppose, qualify what positional asphyxia is.
We heard evidence last year that someone had been sitting in the back of a police car
Yeah.
with their handcuffs tied
Yeah.
behind their hands behind
Yeah.
their back, and that had caused a positional asphyxia.
That's right, yeah.
Is that the type of thing?
That's the type of thing, and it's more common in the back of a cell van when there's not any space to put your legs straight.
Right.
So you bring your knee, the person has to bring their knees to their chest, especially depending on their body size, their weight. That, so whilst they're not actually lying prone, they can still experience the same difficulties of positional asphyxia. So they were brought those in. But what you were saying is roughly, the risk factors, etc., haven't changed.
And in terms of the main ones, as he describes it, the risks are explained to the officers, and they were explained then in 14-15, and they're explained now.
That's correct, yes.
And the main risks, from what you've been saying, relate to the spine, pressure or weight on the back, and that sort of centre line.
Yes.
Could we move to 105, please? He's asked if identifying someone exhibiting positional asphyxia and signs and symptoms of positional asphyxia was covered in the recertification training. He said yes, definitely. You would certainly be looking for, one of the big ones was somebody telling you they can't breathe. It's to be mindful of that. Might be them expelling their last breath. It's somebody that's in difficulty telling you they can't breathe. Mindful you're not ignoring that. There'd be, as Inspector Young has already said, potentially a colour change. Is that the cyanosis that I think you mentioned this morning?
Yes.
The person goes from being compliant to beginning to fight, or the reverse. It could be somebody who's actively trying to resist you, start to go limp. That's something else to be mindful of. And it's another sign that somebody could be affected by that. That's the main ones for me, certainly. Are those the main ones for you too?
Yes. Behavioural change, changes in their breathing, changes in their posture, etc. Yes, just as I say.
And that was being trained at the time.
Yes.
And then if we could go on to 115, please. So Graham Patience says, I'm asked to outline what the recertification training on positional asphyxia is now at present day, and if there have been recent significant changes. I wouldn't say it's changed much. As I said before, the signs and symptoms are still the same. The management of it is still the same. It's always stressed about being live to it and making sure that you're not creating additional risk when somebody's restrained. Keeping off the back, that's something that's always reinforced, and just being live to it and making sure that you're taking somebody away from that risk by moving them off that position whenever it's safe to do so. Would you agree that keeping off the back is something that's always reinforced?
When you can, yes.
Thank you. Could we look at 117, please? And he's asked, Graham Patience has asked here if officers receive training on de-escalation or de-escalation techniques during recertification. And if so, did it form part of the scenario-based training? And he says it wasn't an actual teach. Do you understand what that phrase means?
Yeah.
And tell me.
So when we talk about teaches, we talk about a formalised teach where you have the aims and outcomes of that teach and how to deliver that teach, that lesson, I suppose, if you want, if you call it that. When people say that wasn't a teach, then it's a more informal, potentially an awareness session or a chat or something like that.
Right, thank you. So we could substitute lesson for teach,
yes,
if we're confused. There was a few of the scenarios involved. So again, Graham Patience here seems to be talking about scenarios and scenario-based training here. Everybody's ability is different, so you would have some officers that could be faced with the same scenario that somebody else had with a different outcome. Presumably you'll agree with that.
Yes.
Say, for instance, you might have the subject who ultimately ended up being arrested or something in one situation, but the same scenario being put to a different officer, their ability, they might be able to de-escalate it without the subject having to go any further. They might become compliant. So although maybe not an actual teach, it was something that was talked about, de-escalation strategies and how using your tactical communication can de-escalate a situation. Again, that's almost an expected skill of a police officer. I'm interested in this idea. He uses the phrase de-escalation strategies, and he also talks about tactical communication. Can you explain to us the distinction there?
So tactical communication has always been defined as the ability to communicate to gain control or compliance. So what I didn't like about that was that there's a direct correlation between communication and compliance. I've never particularly liked the word compliance in the first place. I don't think it has the correct connotations, but so tactical communications was limited, from my experience and up until the new programme 2016, was limited to a very small part of a part of the manual. And I don't remember it ever actually being taught, like how to communicate with someone in that conflict situation. Tactical communications and de-escalation, I suppose you could be argued, is roughly the same thing. You are trying to diffuse a situation without having to resort to force by the use of either verbal communication or positional or position. And it's something that police officers have kind of always done, but as this officer says here, it was a kind of expected skill. Now, not every police officer, not every person has that skill. Not every police officer has that skill. So, de-escalation is basically about diffusing the situation. Tactical communications, to me, was always about gaining compliance and control. And I think there's for me, maybe a subtle but a distinct difference.
Thank you. We'll come on to what's in the manual later. But the manual refers to tactical communication in 2013.
Yes.
Right, thank you. So if we look at paragraph 118, Graham Patience then says, insofar as it relates to conflict management, I'm asked what recertification training officers received for dealing with a subject who's been identified as suffering from excited delirium. I think that it was contained in the teach for that, about when we're looking out for the signs. Again, spinning the national decision-making model, would it be something you're obviously going to try and de-escalate it by talking with them? If that works, then that's great. If that doesn't, then you preclude that and then move on to something else. It might be that you eventually have to put hands on somebody. So it's kind of taught at various points through the day, or would have been, about de-escalating. Maybe not directly, but it's something that would be introduced in various teaches because it's applicable to various different parts of the training. Now there's quite a lot in that paragraph, and I wonder if we could go through that and I ask you for your views. He's talking about conflict management and the recertification training that officers would receive. And he talks about the national decision-making model, and we've heard evidence last year about the national decision-making model and how it was used by officers to put information in and review what was happening as they attended an incident. So can I ask you, Graham Patience seems to be talking about this type of training being incorporated in 2014-15, not as a standalone or as a specific teach or lesson, but incorporated into the OST training that officers were getting. And I wondered if you had any comments on that.
Again, that wasn't my experience. I don't recall instructors ever talking about conflict management as such. I don't remember them ever making reference to national decision or the national decision making model as it was back then. Again, when he talks earlier on about scenario-based training, I didn't see any evidence of that. So what he's saying there is, again, potentially that is what he delivered, or he's taken what we brought in 2016 and he's referring to that. But as I say, personally, I never saw any evidence of this type of training being delivered.
Do you remember any training at that time where officers would be trained to if it works? So he's talking about sort of trying to de-escalate, and he says if that works then it's great. If that doesn't, then you preclude that and you move on to something else, and that might be putting hands on somebody. Was there any training where officers went through or talked through those stages where you maybe talk to somebody, see if you can de-escalate, and if not, you preclude that and move on to a different option?
I mean, to achieve what you asked there would require some sort of scenario-based training. And again, from my experience, I didn't see any evidence of scenario-based training back there. So how could then an officer during a training a training environment do that if it's not in a scenario? Unless, as I say, maybe this officer did it on his own, off his own back, and that's the type of training that he involved. But generally, I didn't see any evidence of that type of training at that time.
If there was some sort of scenario-based training designed to allow an officer to practice trying to de-escalate, working that it fails, and then they have to pick another option, could you help the chair understand how that type of scenario-based training could be developed?
So the whole purpose of a scenario-based training is the instructor, the role player, need to know what the outcome or what the desired outcome is going to be, and therefore that role player can thereafter direct the officer so that they can achieve what we are trying to get them to achieve, if that makes sense. So you could have a situation or a scenario where the role player will act in an aggressive manner, they will shout, they will swear, they may throw things about, etc., whatever it may be. That officer will then have to react to that in a proportionate and appropriate manner. And it may be that you can then assess the threat and risk assessment. So they may decide, well, that person has been aggressive to me, they come towards me, I perceive that they're going to be violent, so I may disengage, I may retreat if possible, or withdraw, if possible. I may use a baton, I may use my pava spray, I may decide, because of my skill level, to use empty hand or control restraint techniques. And then so you will know that's what you're looking to assess, their ability to do that. Conversely, you can have a scenario where the role player can still be shouting, swearing, being violent, or exhibiting signs of violence or threats, but not actually make any immediate threat to that officer, won't close the reaction gap to that officer. And what you're looking for there, the desired outcome of that, is for that officer to use their tactical communications or their de-escalation skills to be able just to talk to that individual, to ascertain maybe the reasons for their behaviour, and to try and de-escalate that situation using the strategies that we've provided to them.
And that would be created as part of a scenario-based training?
Yes.
Was there anything, if we leave out scenario-based training, what was in the 2013 manual that could have helped an officer work out how to communicate with a subject who maybe wasn't closing that reaction gap, or who wasn't exhibiting violent tendencies, or who wasn't shouting and swearing?
I mean, the only the only model that we had back then was what we called the 5-step appeal model. And again, that was all about gaining compliance. So that was where you would make a number of appeals to the individual. And I can't remember the exact every step at the minute, you'll see it from the manual, but it's around about, you will, I suppose, make them aware of how they're behaving. You will tell them what they may lose by that behaviour, whether it be financial, whether it be family, social, end up being arrested. And then you will basically then just say, is there anything that I can do or say that will prevent you from doing this behaviour? And if they say no, then the final outcome of that is a physical intervention. To me, it's a very restrictive model, and we removed it in the 2016 programme. So that was all that was able. When we did give them some information in the manual, and again, it's debatable to what extent this was taught practically. We did give them information around about conflict resolution model, whereby it talked about what the threat assessment was, how that person was behaving, what options you could have, etc. So, but it was limited. It was limited.
And the goal of that 5-step line of communication, which we will come back to, that was the goal of that was compliance.
Yes. So comply in a way. So either comply by ceasing and desisting your behaviour, or you end up, I suppose, being arrested, I would imagine.
Right. And so I'm clear, compliance to an officer would be stopping what they're doing?
That's the way it was taught, yes.
Right. All right. Thank you.
Following instructions, yes.
Following instructions. Yeah. And was there any consideration given in relation to the 5 positive steps of communication to the impact of someone who was suffering from mental health problems, for example, or who was intoxicated?
Not that I recall. And obviously those are. I mean, we did talk about barriers to communication in the manual, and obviously intoxication, drugs, mental health challenges, I suppose learning physical disabilities, etc. They were all included because they were obviously barriers to communication, English not being first language, etc. We spoke about that. But again, to the extent that was actually delivered to the students, I would be very surprised if it was at all. It's in the manual, but I don't think it was delivered.
Right. All right. Thank you. Could we look now, please, at 133 and then 145? I'm going to ask you about a mnemonic called CUT. I think it starts in 133. Training in relation to knife incidents and knife defence in 2014-2015. I'm asked what recertification was then on knife incident defence. Insofar as it relates to officers approaching a subject reported to be in possession of a knife, there was only one real practical lesson about it, but there was more the talk about creating distance. There's a principle, an acronym, CUT, C-U-T-T, and it says, creating distance, use cover, transmit. Obviously use your radio and consider other tactical options. And I think there's other information available to the chair that said this was originally CUT, CUT, but later developed into CUTT. Is that correct?
Yes, I added another T. Yes.
You added the other T.
Yes.
We'll come on to that. I'm interested in what he's saying here. Patience is saying there was only one real practical lesson. So officers attending a alleged knife incident or a potential knife incident, there's one real practical lesson, and it's all about CUT. Now in 2014-2015, I think it was CUT.
Yes.
Tell us about CUT.
So CUT was the acronym for the actions an officer would take when faced with an edged weapon threat. And I know that this officer speaks about, we're talking about approaching a subject reported to be in possession of a knife. That's not how it was taught. How it was taught was if an individual spontaneously presented an edged weapon at the officer, There was no mention of tactical approaches, etc. And when being spontaneously presented with an edge weapon threat, the training was you would create that distance where you could, you would use any cover available, and you would shout knife. Now, and so that was the training at the time, and it was basically delivered in the manner of during training, your colleague would be given a knife, who would present it at you, and the student would move back, creating a safe distance, use cover, shout knife so that everybody else there knew there was a knife. And according to that acronym, that's where it stopped. There was no training. What do you do after that? And that's where we brought in the second T later on. But the training at the time was simply that you'd practice that a couple of times.
But as I understand what you've said, the trigger to considering cut was someone brandishing a knife.
That's how it was taught, yes.
That's how it was taught in training
Yes.
at that time.
Yes.
So for an officer who was attending a knife incident but who couldn't see a knife, would this acronym provide them with some mechanism to deal with that situation, or would they be looking elsewhere in their training for assistance?
Yeah, mainly they'd be looking elsewhere in their training. So we talk about contact and cover. I know you mentioned that earlier. We talk about contact and cover. We talk very much about reaction gaps. So whilst, and we did talk about, if there is potential for a knife, then obviously you increase your reaction gap. But again, that was the issue. One of the challenges with the previous programme was there was no tactical training, if that makes sense. There was no training to officers to carry out safe tactics. It was very, very technique based, which is fine, but you need the tactics and the communications to balance that. So I think the training was limited in that respect.
So for an officer who was attending a knife incident where they attend but they can't see the knife, it could be concealed. They'd be thinking about contact and cover, which I've said we will look at
Yes.
when we look at the manual, and increasing the reaction gap, but not necessarily CUT, cut.
No, as I say, the way that was delivered, and if that's the only way it's delivered, then that's normally what the officers will take from it. But that was delivered specifically in that context of that spontaneous presentation.
So the distinction is the distinction if you turn up and can't see a knife but suspect there might be one concealed, you make sure there's a significant reaction gap between you and the person. But if you've no idea that there might be a knife, but someone presents it suddenly and without warning, then that's when you create distance. You move back so the reaction gap is greater.
Yes.
So that's the sort of distinction between those two
Yes.
elements. Right. Thank you. If you could give me a moment, the stenographer may be
Yes,
required.
but we'll take a 15-minute break at this point. Yes, Ms. Graham.
Thank you. I was going to go back to Graham Patience' inquiry statement and this time look at paragraph, let's start with 137, please. Thank you. We're continuing in relation to training in response to a knife incident. I'm asked what the recertification training was on knife incident defence and identifying the most appropriate tactical option insofar as it relates to officers approaching a subject reported to be carrying a knife in public or alleged to have a knife in their possession. Again, officer discretion always comes into it, but it's about individual risk assessment. For me at the time, it was about not approaching, and the onus always seemed to be about creating that space, not putting yourself at the risk of being cut. There was very little about getting hands on somebody with a knife, or I think I mentioned already earlier on, there's slight differences now in the programme, where if you're compromised and you have no option to get away from somebody with a knife, there are tools we can use to deal with that or to minimise the risk. But there wasn't a lot about approaching a subject with a knife in 2013, 2014. Looking at that paragraph, do you agree with what Graham Patience is saying?
Yes, I thoroughly agree there wasn't anything about approaching an officer with a knife. You had to rely on other aspects of the training. And again, about the risk assessment. Obviously we did teach officers about risk assessment. How to conduct a dynamic risk assessment, the elements to consider whilst carrying out that risk assessment.
And he mentions here, for me at the time it was about not approaching, and the onus always seemed to be about creating that space, not putting yourself at the risk of being cut. And just before the break, you were talking about approaching someone where you can't see a knife. It's about making sure there's an increased reaction gap.
Where possible, yeah.
Where possible. And if they pulled out a knife on you, it was about using cut and create distance, perhaps move back from them.
Yes, what I would say though, there was, I suppose, some of the training was contradictory in the respect that you may have officers who've been trained for a while, for a lot, many years, and it was all about gaining control. So it was about closing that distance, because there was a previous school of thought was if you can control that subject, then they can't have access to the knife. So the quicker you can get in close with that individual and control the limbs, particularly obviously the arms, then that was a way of dealing with someone suspected to be in with a knife. And that's the way up until I became an OST instructor, that's always the way I approached it, because that's what I was taught. So, as officers do in a high stress situation, they may rely on, what comes to them first or what they're more familiar with. So there was very much a contradiction in terms where, and we were seeing it operationally, we were seeing CCTV evidence of officers, closing the subject where the information intelligence was that there may have been possession of a knife and trying to exert that physical control.
So if one of the officers had, say, 14 years experience and had training right up until the 2015 incident, is that the sort of timescale where he may have had training in the initial period about closing down that gap rather than creating distance?
It's a distinct possibility, and again depending on who instructed him at what time, because I say there was instructors who that was what they believed in, and despite best efforts would continue to deliver that.
When did it become the training that a gap should be created or that gap should be increased?
I mean, that concept has always been there. you know, of a reaction gap, of staying out with the fighting arc, and if there is a knife, then, you know, best practice is to increase that reaction gap. But as I say, that is what's been taught. I mean, maybe, I don't know, since the middle 2000s. Again, I couldn't say that. It'd just be a guesstimate. But as I said, I know for a fact there was still instructors talking about closing gaps, you know, exerting control, that kind of thing.
Certainly in relation to officers who were taught by Graham Patience, it would appear they were taught about cut and they were
Yeah.
taught about increasing
Absolutely.
the gap.
Yeah.
So insofar as Graham Patience is concerned, that good practice was being
It would appear to be,
taught.
yes.
And for officers who attend that training, who are taught best practice by an instructor like Graham Patience, would they take that on board? Would your expectation be that officers would take on board new training and new ideas, new techniques, and evolve in their thinking?
That would be the gold standard, yes, and that would be definitely for me. That's the ultimate goal. But again, you have to consider situations being different. You have to consider officers risk assessing differently. When you risk assess, a lot of it is based on your own skills, your own experience, your own knowledge, your own assessment of threat and risk. Everybody's got a different assessment of threat and risk, or can have. So, whilst, and again, we have to also consider that it's not always available, that created distance. If you're in a confined space, a house, a close, you know, whatever, then creating that distance sometimes isn't always an option, or maintaining that large reaction gap isn't always an option. I would like to think that majority of officers would take that type of training on board, because it's here to protect them, and it's also there to protect the subject.
And leaving aside the sort of gold standard for a moment, if we just think about an ordinary, reasonable police officer who's complying with their SOPs and their training and the law, would you expect that reasonable officer to have regard to the up-to-date training?
I would expect it, yes.
Okay. Can we look at paragraph 138, please? So this just follows on here. I'm asked if the following tactical options were taught during the recertification training in 1415 as it relates to attending knife incidents. Firstly, I'm asked if remote rendezvous point was taught. Yes, an RVP, it's a commonly used tactic, basically for officers to group prior to engaging with somebody. Again, depending on the threat, it's not always the best option for everybody to go straight to the incident. It's a way for officers to kind of hot brief and have a quick discussion about resources, about who may do what and what tactics or what action they might take when they get there. So it's a meeting point prior to attending an incident. It's an often used tactic. Is that something that you recognise, the tactic of a remote rendezvous point?
Yes, it's a common tactic, but it doesn't form part of the OST curriculum.
Right. So in the 2013 manual and in the training in 2014-15, was there any training at all about remote rendezvous points?
Not that I recall, no.
How would officers be aware that that was an often used tactic or was a tactic open to them, if it's not part of the training?
It would probably come from experience. So, you know, they may have worked with a more experienced officer who used this tactic. They would then take that on, and so forth and so on. So,
we heard evidence from one of the police officers who had been at Hayfield Road, who spoke about this type of tactic and the possibilities of that.
Yeah.
And he certainly seemed to be aware of it, but that wouldn't have been from OST training.
Not from OST. It may have got it for other elements of training, but it certainly wasn't in the curriculum, OST curriculum, no.
And when you say you may have got it from other elements of training, can you think of any other elements of training where that specific option, tactical option is mentioned?
It may, again, it's difficult to recall, it may form part of the probationers training programme, may be mentioned in that, in incident management. If any of the officers had possibly did, or were doing their temporary sergeant, they may have been on a police officer, a police incident officer course where it's heavily emphasised. I can't comment on what other training courses would talk about that.
We've heard people talk about the gold, silver, bronze command structure and how that can be used in relation to an incident.
Yes.
Was there specific training for officers in relation to that structure and how that could be developed as part of an incident, response to an incident?
Not within the OST curriculum, no.
In some other training programme?
I mean, it's heavily, it's the mainstay of firearms training, public order training, I suppose incident management, events, but whether your officer on the shift would even be familiar with that structure is debatable.
Well, certainly from his evidence, he seemed to be familiar with that as an option, and he he gave evidence to the chair about it. I wonder if you could look at the scope records. Remember, we looked at them this morning, and if you could look at the one for Alan Payton. And you obviously have a hard copy, and you've got the list of the training courses that he'd been on according to his scope record. And I'm not going to ask that that be put on the screen, but for those behind me, it's PERC 01207. Just looking at that list of training courses, wonder if you could help the chair. Are there any of those courses where you think information about that type of tactical option might have been shared as part of a training programme?
There's nothing that I see from this that requires a gold, silver, bronze command structure.
Well, no, I'm thinking about the remote rendezvous point.
Oh, the rendezvous point,
yes,
sorry.
That was my mistake.
Nothing I can see of the courses listed that would talk about RVPs.
So perhaps more, as you said a moment ago, from experience rather than a particular course.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon. It's a common tactic in RVP. So, do you require specific training to know about it? I would say no.
Right. So officers can learn on the job.
Yes.
In relation to that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can we look at 139 now, please? So back again to PC Graham Patience's statement. And he says, secondly, I'm asked if observe, wait and feedback was taught. I would say so, yes. It's not something that would specifically be taught in OST or anything. It's not really applicable to the OST programme. Along with RVP, it's not something that we would teach. But again, it's basic policing techniques, I would say. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
So you would expect that most officers, serving officers, would be aware of these tactical options and know what they were.
I would suggest so, yes.
And if we can move on to 140. I'm asked if it's not applicable to OST, where would it be taught? That's a good question. Not something I'd be able to put my finger on. It's more of an instruction, really. Certainly things like meeting at an RVP or staying back and giving feedback, it would be something that would probably be instructed over the radio at the time by a supervisor or something like that. It's not really something that would be instinctive, I would say. Do you agree that it could be something that came over the radio?
Potentially, yes. They say many of the ACR staff have had additional training in incident management, and that would be something that, especially if it maybe came from the inspector, who may also have initial tactical firearms kind of background, it wouldn't surprise me if they gave that an instruction of that sort.
We've also heard evidence that it is open to individual officers to say, hang back, let's meet at a remote rendezvous point before we all converge on an incident. And you're nodding as I say that, so is that something that can be done as well?
Depending on the circumstances, but it's always an option.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So individual officers themselves could also ask other officers to rendezvous at a certain point.
Absolutely.
And we're moving on to 141. I'm asked if verbal dominance or a hard stop approach was taught. Again, it's not something that would be applicable to the OST programme, but that would potentially fall into your sort of tactical communications side of things to gain compliance. That would certainly be part of that. On first engagement with a subject, your first attempt would be to try and get verbal compliance. If it's somebody with a knife, you'd hope that that would be enough to get them to put the knife down and comply and gain control after that. So yes, that would definitely be part of it. Would you agree with that description?
Yes, that was the ethos at the time, yes.
Thank you. And then 142, I'm asked what the recertification training was in relation to the management of knife incidents and identifying the most appropriate option when arriving at an incident where circumstances of a knife remained concealed on the subject and is not visible. Again, that would come down to how you approach the subject and what tactical communication you're using. Obviously asking them if they have a weapon on them. You would ultimately be keen to get control of that person at some point to effect a search, because you still have to act on the information that you've got to see if the person potentially has a knife. So you'd want to either confirm it or confirm they haven't got one. So you'd have to get hands on at some point. Do you agree with that?
If that person's not going to cooperate with you, then you have a duty, to potentially detain them and effect a search. So the only way to do that is to physically control the person, yes.
All right, thank you. Can I ask you to look at, I'm going to ask you to look at 152, but we may need to go to the immediate prior state. If we go to 151 first of all, and Graham Patience in this part of his inquiry statement was asked to look at something you had said in your second inquiry statement. And you had said, by way of example, I experienced some instructors telling students that the best way to deal with someone who is in possession of a weapon or a knife is to physically control them, because that way they can't hurt you. This approach goes against the training ethos of CUT. We taught in 2015 officers who are faced with a knife to, where appropriate, create distance, use cover and transmit. That's CUT. Immediately going in to physically control someone with a knife puts the officer at grave risk of injury. In the early days of my police career, I recall that training given in relation to knife incidents had a strong emphasis on gaining physical control. I continued to see this type outdated training being delivered intermittently during my quality assurance visits conducted as part of my OST review in 14 and 15. Teaching officers to attempt to physically control persons with a knife is problematic, as inevitably some will use it and potentially get seriously injured. There is not enough time in the programme to teach officers to effectively use this tactic and become totally competent at it. And Graham Patience says at 152 that he would agree with what you've said. I've never seen anybody teach the fact that they could go in and take control, because that would completely go against what the training would have been at the time. And you're putting yourself at huge criticism if you ever taught a student to, I just go in and take control of the person with the knife. That's certainly nothing I ever taught, and I would agree with the inspector's concerns there if he did see that. So it seems that Graham Patience was not teaching that as part of refresher training prior to May 2015. And you obviously have concerns that that lingered, and you saw it on occasions. Did you see it anywhere in Fife?
No.
No. Thank you. I'd like to look at 157, please. and this relates to Graham Patience's comments. There's another one where you would essentially get the person in an arm wrap, and you're close in where the knife is essentially sort of kept to the rear. So the only potential cut you could have is maybe against your stab vest. Is this in relation to a technique to allow you to gain control of someone with a possible knife?
I think what he's referring to here is one of the new techniques that potentially was introduced, whereby if you are presented with an edged weapon and you cannot withdraw or use a tactical option, another, a bat and pab or whatever it may be, then I think for a short period of time they were teaching an arm wrap where you would wrap the hand with the knife in against your body. I was certainly shown that in my latest OST. Whether it's still in, I don't know.
Right. Maybe I should look at the 156 above, because it does talk about recent changes that have been introduced for knife incidents in defence, and there's a couple of holds now. So this seems to be a new part of the training programme for officers dealing with knife incidents.
It appears to be, yes.
Right. But that wasn't something that was being taught in 2014, 2015?
No.
Thank you. Then can we look at 165, please? Now, there's talk here of paragraph 4.6 of what is the use of force SOP. And I don't need to go to that SOP, but we've heard evidence last year about paragraphs 4.6 and 4.7 of that SOP. 4.6 relates to profiled offender behaviour, which is categorised at 6 levels, ranging from compliance up in terms of severity of behaviour. And also 4.7 related to reasonable officer response. And that was categorised up to level 5, which was deadly a response. So again, it went up in grades of severity. Can we look at paragraph 165? We have it here on the screen. Without looking at the actual levels, we don't need to go through each of the levels, but you'll see that level 1 is compliance, and then we'll go through just as we... Level 2 is verbal resistance and or gestures, moving up to passive resistance. Level 4, active resistance. 5 is assaultive, and 6 is serious aggravated assaultive resistance. Keep going. And then Graham Patience was asked if recertification training covered the profile offender behaviour as outlined above, and he said yes, it hasn't changed at all. The profiled offender behaviour hasn't changed, and it was pertinent at the time. And I think, as we'll see at some point, it's in the 2013 manual.
Yes.
At 167 he says, I'm asked what level of risk of the profiled offender behaviour would I apply to the following situations. And he goes through that in some detail, and I don't need to go through that with you. The chair can consider that statement as it is. But as I understand the position, paragraph 4.7 of the use of force SOP, which contained reasonable officer responses, levels 1 to 5, has been removed now from the up-to-date manual. Is that right?
Yes.
And can you explain why that is?
It was replaced with the tactical options model.
Right, so it's a direct swap, if you like.
Yes. What we found was that the reasonable officer response and the profile offender behaviour was quite a restrictive model. And basically you would have a direct correlation between profile offender behaviour and thereafter what your option can be. And there wasn't any, I suppose, really cognizance given to impact factors, warning, danger signs, etc. So it was, in my view, it was quite a restrictive model. I know that the College of Police in England and Wales had did away with it because of that fact, and they've just simply replaced it with the national decision model, and that's what we did. So we replaced it with the national decision model and the tactical options model.
So it's completely removed from the training as such.
Yes.
And now officers are taught about the national decision-making model.
Yes, we still talk about profile offender behaviour, but not in that direct correlation to reasonable officer response options. Basically, profile offender behaviour is helpful because it allows officers to articulate the behaviour of an individual, but we've removed that direct correlation to if someone's showing this, you can do this, but you can't do that, which it doesn't take into account the differing circumstances, the different factors.
And we heard evidence last year that there are 6 profiled offender behaviours, but only 5 reasonable officer responses.
Options, yes.
So there wasn't a direct correlation for every single profiled offender behaviour either.
And that model had been in existence, I think, from the 80s or the 90s, and it was outdated. And again, it didn't take into account, the benefits of the national decision model.
And tell the Chair please about the benefits of the national decision-making model and the tactical options model. How's that improved training for officers?
So before we would teach officers, as I said, if a subject is doing X, Y or X, then you draw a line on the graph and it comes to your reasonable officer response option. It doesn't take into account, as I said, impact factors, warning signs, danger signs, age, sex, build, all these kind of things that are all these impact factors in a situation. The benefit of the national decision module is it's that cyclic model which you can use a number of times during the one instant as your information and your intelligence changes, and which inevitably it does change, and sometimes very rapidly. So instead of having correlations and being quite restrictive, it allows you to work through in a manner that's less restrictive. And it allows you to take into account different areas that then will lead into the next part of the model, which lead into the next part of the model, and then as anything changes, you can just respin.
So it's more flexible.
Much more flexible, yes.
And does it allow you to adapt your options depending on the information and intelligence you have?
Yes. So it allows you to take your information intelligence, it allows you to formulate a threat assessment based on that. From that threat assessment, it basically allows you to what your options could be based on that threat assessment, what your police powers are, your policies are, and what action you can take, and then you just, as that information intelligence changes, you go through it again. And it's a worldwide accepted model, and it doesn't have to be within a conflict situation. It can be utilised and applied to any policing situation.
And the tactical options, is that an opportunity for during training to explore those tactical options and train officers more about the tactics that they can adopt?
Yes, so before we ever just we spoke about techniques and techniques only, so batons, control and restraint. The tactical options model introduces and allows officers more awareness around about they can disengage, they can withdraw, they can call specialist assistance, and it just reminds them. So the tactical options module sits in the options and contingencies part of the NDM, and it fits nicely in there.
And so when the Chair comes to look at later manuals such as the 2016 manual, he'll be able to consider the tactical options model and national decision making model that will be within that later model.
That's it.
Manual.
Yes, it was in the 2016 manual. Yes. And
that is a consistent approach, both in England and Wales, but also more internationally, I think you said.
Yes, specifically England and Wales. I know they've introduced it in the US to various. I know it's new in Australia and other places. So.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 172, please? Now, Graham Patience says here, this follows on from a number of paragraphs. It says, circumstances where you place weight on a person during restraint. Level 4, because you know the person is actively resistant, there's a physical form of resistance. As it says there, they're actively obstructing. So yes, if there was a level of restraint being put on somebody because it's a way off the scale from compliance, that person's clearly not being compliant. So you have to gain control by some means, and I would certainly say it'd be coming about level 4. So he's talking about profiled offender behaviour where someone is resisting, actively resisting, complying with police officers, and he's indicating that would be roughly about level 4. And
Active resistance, yes.
active resistance, right. And then he comes on to talk about paragraph 4.7 of reasonable officer response, but I think I've already spoken to you about that. Now, there was a part I had noted. Give me a moment. Essentially, there was a part of Graham Patience's statement where he talked about completion of use of force forms. And I'd noted it as 172, but I must have made a mistake with my numbering. I may be able to check that shortly. He had indicated there's always a requirement for teaching that. But in your, here it is, 171. I was close. 171. Oh no, do you know? Seem to have something wrong. Can I simply ask you, was there any training in 2014-2015 which was about completing use of spray forms, having discharged a CS spray, anything about having to complete forms about that, and anything about having to complete use of force forms where you've used force on during your shift?
Yeah, so on the creation of Police Scotland and the subsequent creation of PERC and that statutory requirement to report to PERC any firearms discharge, there was notification sent out by the force of the requirement to submit a CS, as it was, or part of a discharge form. So that was a requirement. There is a requirement, I suppose, if you call it that, an expectation that officers will also submit a use of force form. But that's not always done. Or wasn't anyway, sorry.
Right. I'm interested in the sort of level of training that would have been given as part of OST in relation to paperwork, completing forms, that type of thing. Do you remember if that was part of the training programme?
Not back then, no.
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 So, although you're training techniques in terms of using force on a subject, the paperwork aspect of that, if I can call it that, about forms, that wasn't covered at all.
It may be covered by individual instructors saying, if you use force, you have to submit a form.
Right.
Or if you discharge PAV or CS, you have to submit this form. But I think that was potentially that was the extent of it. Yes.
Nothing more sort of detailed than that.
Not to my recollection.
Not to your knowledge.
No.
All right. Thank you. And so, how would officers again be expected to be aware of the requirement to complete forms if they used force or discharged a CS spray?
Again, I know there was a memo with regards to the requirement. So a memo onto the intranet, and thereafter, if a memo is published, then it's the divisional commander's responsibility to ensure that memo's distributed down to the officer under their command. I think there was also a memo around about, I know in my time there was a number of memos around about use of force forms and the requirement to complete them.
So in terms of raising awareness amongst the serving police officers, it's not all down to the OST programme or training programmes. It's also about awareness from the work that you do every day and being in a police office and speaking to other officers, that type of
You
thing.
could say that, yes.
Yeah. Can I ask you about your expectations about refresher training? It's once a year. Some witnesses have given comments about the effectiveness of that. Others have spoken about whether it should be more regular, or others have said no. There seem to be differing views, and I'm interested in your expectations. What do you think about training, refresher training once a year, in terms of keeping officers up to speed with their skills?
My personal view is that once a year is not sufficient.
And what are your concerns if it is only once a year?
The biggest one is obviously the skill fade. So when you pack an awful lot of information, training, instruction into 1 or 2 days and don't give people enough time to sufficiently replicate or practice that, then it gets forgotten relatively quickly.
And when you say relatively quickly, can you help the chair understand what you mean?
I mean, I can't give I couldn't give a definite, you will forget it in 2 months or 3 months. But from my experience, I mean, I've had officers will say to me, I can't remember what I trained in last week or two, because it was such a whirlwind. And I'm talking about the programme back then. It was such a whirlwind of far too many techniques and 30 seconds per technique, and they'd forgotten it by the afternoon. So for that type of activity, for me, at least every 6 months. And again, I don't know what the science is. As I say, I haven't been involved in many years, so. But that's my own personal view. My view is it's a very, very high risk activity. Control and restraint, use of force. And I think that the training and the amount of time that's dedicated to that training should reflect that.
If there was training every 6 months, what would your expectations be about their ability to recall the training and put it into practice if they were faced with a situation?
Well, my expectations would be that they would be more proficient. Because they're more familiar with the training. But you can have training every 6 months. It's not how often you train, it's the effectiveness of the training. So it's what you actually train, how you deliver it. You can have training every 3 months, and if it's substandard or insufficient training, then it's pointless. So for me, it's a combination of frequency and effectiveness of the training.
And you've talked about techniques and the number of techniques that could be trained.
Sorry.
No, sorry. You've talked about the large number of techniques that are trained in refresher training. Do you have any views about maybe restricting the number of techniques that are being taught during the annual refresher? Would that help retention and avoid skill fade?
Yes,
At least in relation to those particular.
Yes, but my belief and experience would be yes. The more time you can practice a particular technique, then the more you will retain that technique, the more you'll be proficient in it. So reduce the number of techniques whilst increasing the length of time you get to practice those techniques, in my view, would increase proficiency and confidence in the officers.
So fewer techniques with more time to practice. And is there a way that, you in your position as national coordinator or head of the department, was there a way that you were able to analyse which techniques were the most used?
Yes, it's within my national review. So we looked at all the use of force forms that had been submitted, and we were able to extract the data of what techniques were used more often We also, I think, over 2,000 evaluation forms we put out, and we held focus groups. So we got the data from there, and we realised very quickly that, and I can't remember the exact percentage it's in the review document, but we realised very quickly that there was a large number or a large part of that programme was never getting used operationally, for a number of reasons.
I'd like to come on to the manual now. We've talked a lot about the 2013 manual in sort of abstract. I'd like to come on and look at that with you, if I may. And we'll be able to get that up on the screen. There's roughly about 30 pages in Module 1 that I'm particularly interested in. There's one or two other elements. Sorry. Yes, and I'll need to give you the doc ID for that manual, and it's PS 10938. Sorry. So we'll have that on the screen. I'm going to go through certain Module 1 and also some other pages with you. And just to, again, to put this into context before we start, this manual came into being, into force, if you like, 1st September 2013.
Yes.
And at that time, you were an instructor in Tullyallen.
Yes.
And you were given a copy of this manual.
Yes.
And from then on, the training you delivered to to probationers would have been on the content of this manual.
Yes.
As I understand your statement, you didn't have any input into this manual or how it was drafted or the techniques included. That was just something that you were given at that time.
Yeah, I wasn't involved in OST at the time of the writing, no.
Thank you. And then so that's September 2013. In October 2013, a month later, you become responsible for OST training at Tullyallen for probationers. And then the following year, September 2014, you were the National Officer Safety Coordinator.
Yes.
And this manual is something that you were familiar with both as a trainer and then through your other roles.
Yes.
Thank you. Let's look at Module 1, if we can go down the page, please. And I won't go through the index, I'll just take you, if I may, to page 2 first of all. We'll see Module 1, Officer Safety Theory. And if we can move down, please. I want to go to the first sort of text. There we are. So that's the covering page, and then we'll go on to the next page. So that's Module 1, and it lists 14 sections, and then it says Section 1, and it's got aims and learning outcomes at the beginning. And if you go down, please, onto... I have this as page 3 of the manual. It's headed Module 1, Human Rights. Let me just check, that's PDF page 3, is it? If we go down to the bottom of that page, we can see the number 3, and I just want to check I'm not using the incorrect numbering. There we are, page 3. Is that PDF page 3 as well? Can we just check? It's page 3 I want to look at. It's not. Well, I'll be able to check that tonight. But if we're on the right page at the moment, can we go to the top of that page, please? So this is page 3 of the manual. Module 1, Human Rights Act. And so this is the very first thing that we see in the manual itself. And it talks about the Human Rights Act conferring a number of rights, and the main concerns for officers who may require to use some degree of force in the execution of their duty are Articles 2, 3 and 5. And you explain what those articles are on that page, or that's part of the training. And Article 2 Paragraph 2, which is at the bottom of the page. Deprivation of life shall not be regarded as inflicted in contravention of this article when it results from the use of force which is no more than absolutely necessary. Now, is it part of the OST, or was it part of the OST training from the instigation of this manual that you taught probationers and refreshers about the importance of human rights and Article 2?
It was taught to probationers during initial courses. I don't recall it ever being taught during refresher courses.
So for any officer who was joining the service at some point after 1998 or early 2000s, would they have had training on human rights at that point?
They would have it during their initial probationer training at Tullyallen. There was a human rights lesson, and I believe it was referred to in the OST programme back then for the initial course. And officers may have referred to it during refresher training, but it wasn't in the curriculum for refresher training, so it would have been haphazard whether instructors referred to. They may make mentions to Article 2.
Would serving officers have had any other discussions about Article 2 or the importance of using force no more than absolutely necessary up to May 2015?
I couldn't say it.
Certainly not part of the curriculum
No.
for OST.
No.
And then if we can move on to the following page, page 4. And I'd like to look at this section regarding the mnemonic plane, PLANE, and I'd like to look at that. If we can go down to the bottom of so if we can have that on the screen, we'll see that PLANE stands for proportionate, legality, accountable, necessary and ethical. Now, we heard evidence last year from one of the officers about this mnemonic and how it was something in his mind in relation to making sure that any use of force was legal and he was justified in using that force. So can you explain to us what the training was for both probationers and refreshers in terms of the 2013 manual?
So for the probationers during the initial OST course, there was a PowerPoint presentation, and that was included part of their OST theory, which was day one of their initial OST course. The refreshers had no classroom input to them, so there was a reference to plane, and again that was usually, in my experience, and I delivered it, was we would make reference to plane all the time. So we're talking about a technique, we would always talk about it has to be proportionate, reasonable and necessary, but there was no, I suppose, formalised lesson or teach delivered during the refresher course.
But your expectation would be that serving officers would be aware of the plane mnemonic and what it means,
Yes.
and that they would understand why they're being taught that?
I would suggest so, yes.
So serving officers from 2013 at least would know that officers should record their decision to use force and must be able to account for why they chose a particular course of action, and in some cases what other options may have been available and why these were not chosen. We heard evidence last year about preclusion.
Yes.
There might be a number of options available.
Yes.
If you to use minimum force, you may want to try less forceful options first, preclude them, and then move on up the scale. Or you may decide those less forceful options are simply not going to be successful,
Yes.
and move straight into a higher level.
Yes.
Is that a reasonable?
Yeah, preclusion is part
Yeah.
of the accountability part. Yeah.
And your expectation would be that all officers, serving officers, would know about preclusion
I would like to think so, yes.
and using minimum force.
Yes.
And I think in your inquiry statement, we don't need to go to this, it's paragraph 68 of SBPI 00153. I think you weren't sure if ethical was actually in the 2013 manual. But looking at it now,
Yes, yes.
on page 4, can you see it, Karen?
I see it, yes,
it
of
does.
course, yeah.
Right. And I think you spoke earlier today about the ethics, and was that something to do with a code of conduct?
The code of
Ethical
the Police Scotland Code of Ethics, yes.
Code of ethics, thank you. And then could I ask you something else that Graham Patience said in his statement, and again we don't need to go to that, but it's paragraph 162. He talked about when he was doing his training that there were wall posters around, some would have the plain mnemonic on them, and there was other information available to officers from those posters. Do you remember, does that accord with your recollection?
Yes, most OST training venues would have a number of posters, normally with reasonable officer response options, with profile behind the behaviour, with plain, etc., displayed on the walls of the venue. Yes.
So any officer who was having, would this be in Tullyallen? Or generally, wherever they were having their training?
It was wherever, well, they definitely were permanently displayed in the training area at Tullyallen. Some of the venues I visited in 14, 15 didn't have them. Some did. Some would put them up just when, because these gym halls were maybe used for other purposes.
Right.
So when they're used for OST, some of the instructors would put them up, others wouldn't.
I understand there's a training location, or was in Glenrothes,
Yes.
for 2014-2015 trainees. From your recollection, did they have posters up?
I couldn't remember.
Can't remember.
Sorry.
Can we move on to the next page, please? Page 5. And this is headed up use of force. And it says criteria for use of force. An officer's use of force must be reasonable. It's possible to demonstrate that the force used was reasonable by 2 methods. And here it talks about justification and preclusion. We've mentioned preclusion already. To what extent were those principles reinforced at refresher training?
Again, that would come down to, because there wasn't a formalised lesson during, like a formalised, I suppose, theory lesson delivered, it would be very much down to the individual, at that time, very much down to the individual instructor as to what extent they would make reference to justification, preclusion, plain.
So would it always be mentioned to probationers?
It was part of the OST theory, yes.
But for refreshers, it would depend on the instructor.
At that time, yes.
And their preclusion is said, other force options must have either been attempted and failed or have been considered and found to be inappropriate under the circumstances. And force can be described as the use of strength, power and energy, but includes anything that tends to produce an effect on the mind or will of another. And we heard an example last year about standing in front of a doorway and blocking an exit could in itself be a use of force.
Absolutely, yes.
And if we look at section 3, which is the top of the right hand column here, it says section 20, Constable's General Duties, and if we go down to number 2, it's talking about when taking lawful measures. A constable must take every precaution to ensure that a person charged with an offence is not unreasonably or unnecessarily detained in custody. And police officers use force to establish control of people and situations for the following reasons. And I'm interested in that reference there to police officers using force to establish control. Was there an emphasis then at that time on control?
Absolutely. The emphasis was on control and compliance, yes.
And I think you've explained that's now changed, the emphasis has changed now to some extent.
I think we tried to change it 2016. To what extent now, how that's progressed, I couldn't comment. But yeah, we tried to get away from that ethos of that authoritarian ethos of control, compliance, that kind of thing.
We've heard that you're no longer a police force, you're now a police service. And is that part of this ethos of changing the general approach?
I couldn't comment on the reasoning why we changed that. That would be
All right.
fine. Others, I'm afraid.
If we move further down the page, we see there, whatever the use of force the officer will require to answer, could the officer have achieved the same lawful objective by using a lower force option? So is this something that was emphasised, the idea of using minimum force?
You know, yeah, you know, we talk about least intrusive, we talk about the minimum amount of force for the minimum amount of time. So yeah, that was emphasised. Yeah.
So even in the 2013 manual, officers were encouraged to be thinking about using the least forceful option.
Again, it's in the manual, and to say it again, to what extent it was delivered to the officers during the refresher training, is I couldn't say, because
So definitely taught to probationers.
yes,
But it would be up to individual trainers for refresher training.
yes, at that time, yeah.
Can I see the last paragraph on this page 5? 2 officers confronted with the same set of circumstances may react differently. They may select different force options, each of which they perceived to be appropriate and reasonable for them. It is for each officer to justify their individual course of action. The Police Scotland National Decision Model should be considered at all times. So we've heard evidence last year that it is for each individual officer to justify their own use of force,
Absolutely.
and that each individual officer has to justify every distinct use of force.
Absolutely, yes.
And so even if there's 3 baton strikes, they have to justify each of those 3
Yes.
baton strikes. And there's reference there to the National Decision Model, and it says it should be considered at all times. And I think you've said, we'll come on to other references to that in the manual, but you said there wasn't really a lot of training on that, Matt. No. So it's referenced in the 2013 manual, but not.
Yeah, that's correct, yeah. It was.
So was that final paragraph there, was the position on the manual and the way it was trained the same for that? Always taught to probationers, up to individual instructors for refreshers.
Yes, and to an extent, because not all parts of the manual, so not everything that's in the manual would have been physically delivered in a theory lesson to probationers. It may at times be referenced parts of the manual, and then I you know, from my experience, very little of any of this that was in the manual was actually, apart from the techniques, was actually referenced during refresher training.
Right. And then if we move on to page 6, we're coming on to tactical communications, and given the time, I'm going to suggest that perhaps we don't address that.
Yes, very well. We'll try until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.